In the autumn of 1981, on the small Japanese island of Sado, 40 kilometers off the coast of Niigata Prefecture in the Sea of Japan, 5 wild crested ibises were captured by a government-led team and brought into a conservation center on the western edge of the island. They were the last wild members of their species in Japan. The country that had once had thousands of them, that had written poems about them for more than 1,000 years, that had named entire ceremonial colors after their pink-tinged feathers, had reached the final 5. Every attempt to breed them in captivity failed. The birds were old. Their genetics were compromised. By 2003, the last native Japanese crested ibis was dead. The species was gone. And then, 40 years after those last 5 birds were taken into captivity, scientists working on Sado Island stood on the edge of a rice paddy in the early morning, watched a flock of crested ibises wade through the shallow water, and produced the kind of population data that the conservation literature does not normally produce about a species that has been extinct in the wild within living memory. But before you can understand what made those scientists go quiet, you need to understand what happened across those 40 years, and why what happened could not have been planned by anyone in 1981, and could not have happened anywhere except on Sado Island. The crested ibis, known in Japan as the toki, is a medium-sized wading bird with white plumage tinged pink in breeding season, a long curved beak, and a bare red face. It is not a spectacular bird in the way that eagles or flamingos are spectacular. Its power was always quieter than that. For more than 1,000 years, it waded through the flooded rice paddies of East Asia, Japan, China, Korea, and eastern Russia, feeding on loaches, frogs, freshwater crabs, and small fish in the shallow water between the rice rows. Japanese imperial poetry mentioned it. Its feathers appeared in ceremonial dress. Farmers who worked the paddies alongside it considered it simply part of the landscape, a bird that had always been there, that would always be there until it wasn't. The collapse came in 3 overlapping waves that took less than a century to complete. The first was hunting. The crested ibis had been formally protected in Japan since 1934. But the prohibition came too late for most of the country. Before protection, the birds had been shot for their feathers, trapped for collection, and hunted for food across the length of Japan's main islands. By the time the law arrived, the population outside of a few remote refuges had already been reduced to fragments. The second wave was the transformation of Japanese agriculture after World War II. The government promoted the intensive use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers to maximize rice yields on a land-scarce island nation rebuilding from destruction. The pesticides did what they were designed to do. They eliminated insects and small invertebrates from the rice paddies. They also eliminated the food that crested ibises depended on. A bird that fed on loaches and frogs in paddies had nowhere to feed when the loaches and frogs were gone. The third wave was habitat loss. Wetlands were drained, streams were channeled. The complex flooded landscapes that crested ibises used for nesting were converted into the simplified agricultural geography of post-war Japan. On Sado Island, the last stronghold held longer than anywhere else. The island's relative isolation, its traditional farming practices, and the attachment of its residents to the bird they had lived alongside for generations kept a small population alive into the 1970s. A farmer named Takano Takagi, who had counted as many as 27 crested ibises feeding in the rice paddies around his village as late as 1930, spent 25 years bringing freshwater crabs and frogs to the birds as their numbers declined and their food sources disappeared. He was joined by neighbors. The entire community of Nibu village fed the last birds through the 1950s and the 1960s out of a combination of conservation instinct and cultural loyalty that no government program had organized or funded. It was not enough. By 1981, the last 5 wild crested ibises on Sado had been captured and brought into the Sado Japanese Crested Ibis Conservation Center. Every attempt to breed them in captivity failed. Japan's crested ibis population was functionally finished. And then the discovery in China changed everything. When ornithologists confirmed the existence of 7 wild crested ibises in Shanxi province in 1981, birds that China had believed extinct for decades, the response from Japan was immediate. A government conservation partnership was established between Tokyo and Beijing, remarkable in itself, given the political complexity of the relationship at the time. China agreed to provide breeding stock. In 1999, a Chinese pair named Yang Yang and Yu Yu arrived at the Sado Conservation Center. The breeding program that followed produced its first Japanese-born crested ibis chicks in the early 2000s. The last native Japanese crested ibis died in 2003. By then, the captive population at Sado had grown large enough that the reintroduction program was already being planned. But here is the problem that no amount of captive breeding could solve on its own. The birds that had disappeared from Sado's rice paddies had disappeared because Sado's rice paddies had stopped supporting them. The pesticides that had eliminated the loaches and frogs and freshwater crabs that crested ibises fed on were still being applied. The drainage systems that had simplified Sado's wetland landscape were still in place. Releasing captive-bred birds into a landscape that had driven the species to extinction would produce, at best, a population on permanent life support. Birds that survived only because humans continued to supplement their food and manage their habitat. At worst, it would produce nothing. A bird released into a paddy with no food in it does not establish a wild population. It starves. The recovery program's designers understood this clearly. Their solution was one of the most ambitious pieces of landscape-scale ecological engineering ever attempted in Japan. Not with machinery, but with a certification scheme for rice. In 2008, the same year, the first 10 captive-bred crested ibises were released into the wild on Sado. The Sado Agricultural Cooperative launched the Toki to Kurasu Sato program, a crop certification that functioned similarly to an organic label, but with a highly specific purpose. Rice certified under the program had to be grown using at least 50% fewer pesticides and chemical fertilizers than standard local practice. Farmers had to refrain from using herbicides on the embankments between fields. They had to conduct biodiversity surveys of their paddies 2 times a year, and they had to adopt at least one of 4 ecological farming methods specifically designed to restore the food web that crested ibises depended on, creating deep puddles around field margins that held water through summer and provided habitat for the small aquatic animals the birds fed on, constructing channels that allowed fish to move freely between paddies and waterways, maintaining winter flooding that kept the soil invertebrate community alive through cold months, or filling fields with water during the rice drying period rather than draining them completely. The economic logic was direct and deliberate. Rice certified under the Toki to Kurasu Sato program sold at a premium. 1,500 yen for 5 kilograms of half-pesticide rice compared to the standard price, and 4,000 yen for the same amount of fully organic rice. Farmers who converted received government grants of 27,000 yen per 1,000 square meters to compensate for reduced yields during the transition period. The system was designed to make ibis-friendly farming more profitable than conventional farming, not merely more virtuous. By 2016, certified ibis-friendly paddy land covered 1,600 hectares, approximately 25% of all rice-growing area on Sado Island. That number was projected to grow to 2,600 hectares, representing more than 42% of the island's total rice harvest area within the following years. On September 25, 2008, the first 10 captive-bred crested ibises were released into the wild in the mountainous Sado area of the island. It was the first time the species had flown free in Japan since 1981. The birds found food in paddies, where farmers had reduced pesticide use. They roosted in the mixed woodlands that edge Sado's agricultural valleys. They were monitored constantly by radio tracking, by citizen scientist observers, and by the farmers themselves, who had been trained to record sightings in a biodiversity GIS system that mapped every ibis observation against the management practices of each individual field. In April 2012, 3 crested ibis chicks hatched on Sado Island in the wild. It was the first time chicks had hatched wild in Japan in 36 years. The project team had hoped this would happen eventually. The speed at which it happened, in the 4th year of releases from birds that had spent their entire lives in captivity before being released, was not what anyone had modeled. From 2008 to 2021, 415 crested ibises were released into the wild on Sado. Wild-born chicks added to the population from 2012 onward. The recovery accelerated in 2019, when the wild population reached 396 individuals. The crested ibis was formally downlisted on Japan's National Red List from EW, extinct in the wild, to Class 1A, critically endangered. The species that had been erased from the Japanese sky within living memory was being reclassified because there were now too many of them to qualify as functionally extinct. By June 2022, nearly 500 crested ibises were living wild on Sado Island. And by 2024, when the population data was compiled for the 40-year anniversary of the original captive breeding effort, the number had passed 580. That was the moment the scientists stopped speaking. The recovery had not just produced a number, it had produced a phenomenon that the modeling work done in the 1980s had explicitly considered impossible. Captive-bred birds, released into a landscape that had been ecologically restored around their requirements, had not merely survived. They had organized themselves into a wild population that was now reproducing at rates indistinguishable from a never-extinct species. The genetic bottleneck of the founding Chinese pair had not produced the inbreeding collapse that population biology had predicted. The agricultural landscape, restructured around the certification program, had not failed to support them. The local communities, including the descendants of the farmers who had carried freshwater crabs to the last 5 birds in the 1950s, had not abandoned the project across the 4 decades it took to produce results. Professor Kentaro Yoshida and his colleagues at Niigata University, analyzing the transformation from 1999 to 2019, identified what they called a triple win outcome. Biodiversity recovered as the crested ibis population grew. Agriculture transformed as pesticide use fell and ecological farming practices spread. And the local economy strengthened as ibis tourism and certified rice premiums generated new revenue streams that had not existed before. The three outcomes reinforced each other. More birds meant more tourists. More tourists meant more revenue for certification. More certification meant more ibis-friendly paddy. More ibis-friendly paddy meant more birds. An estimated 52,092 tourists visited Sado Island annually by 2021, drawn specifically by the crested ibis. From an economic input-output analysis, the contribution of ibis tourism to the regional economy was estimated at 4.45 billion yen. Tourists donated approximately 16 million yen annually to Toki Forest Park. The ripple effects through agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, the industries that preserved crested ibis habitat as a consequence of their own operations, added approximately 34 million yen. The bird that had been poisoned out of existence by Japanese agricultural chemicals had, in returning, made the reduction of those chemicals economically rational. The crested ibis had not simply recovered, it had restructured the island's relationship with its own land. There is a rice paddy on Sado Island where Takano Takagi once carried freshwater crabs to the last birds still alive in Nibu village. He fed them by hand through the 1950s and the 1960s because he could not bear to watch them starve. He died before the reintroduction program began. The paddies around his village are now certified ibis-friendly land. The farmers who work them conduct biodiversity surveys twice a year and record their observations in a GIS system that maps every crested ibis sighting against the field it was made in. In the early morning, when the water in the paddy is still and the mist has not yet lifted from the Sea of Japan, crested ibises wade through the same flooded rows that Takano worked for half a century. Their pink-tinged wings catch the first light. Their curved beaks probe the shallow water for the loaches and freshwater crabs that have returned because the pesticides that killed them have been reduced by half or removed entirely because a certification scheme made that reduction profitable. 7 birds found in a mountain valley in China in 1981. 5 last birds taken into captivity on Sado the same year. 40 years of captive breeding, ecological farming, and citizen monitoring. Nearly 600 birds in the sky above Sado today, and rice paddies that feed both the birds and the farmers more reliably than the pesticide-intensive system that had replaced them. That is not a coincidence. That is what a species does when the landscape is rebuilt around what it needs to survive, and what the landscape does when the species is allowed to be part of it again. And it is what made the scientists working on the 2024 population survey stand in silence on the edge of a rice paddy in Nibu village, watching the descendants of 7 Chinese birds forage in the same fields where the last 5 Japanese birds had once been fed by hand. But Japan is not the only country where a bird pulled back from the absolute edge of extinction has reshaped the landscape around its recovery. In our next video, we travel to California, where in 1987, the last 27 wild condors were caught and locked in zoo enclosures, and where the captive breeding program that followed built a population of more than 500 birds that is still, in 2024, dying from the same cause that put them in those cages in the first place. If you thought 7 ibises rebuilding an island economy was unexpected, wait until you see what happens when the thing killing a species refuses to go away, no matter how many birds you release. You will not look at conservation the same way again